I think more so than some of the other fields we've had, it makes sense to spend a few moments on the question, what's going on in this field of developmental psychology? There's a bunch of these branches of psychology. Developmental psychology is one of the 4 or 5 biggest ones. If psychologists gather for some convention on developmental psychology, there's thousands of them. If you picture applications of psychology, one of the biggest applications is to the world of education, educational technologies, motivating students, helping them. That entire world of educational applications is, of course, relevant to developmental or informed by developmental psychology. So I'm going to take a moment to say what it is. Frankly, this may be more systematic than what's in the textbook. The textbook tells you what it is, too, but it's reasonable spelling it out, including by way of an analogy that I'll put up. The science part of it, what people are trying to do is to see if there are any trends in psychological development. So this is exactly analogous to something in biology that's so obvious you don't even think about it. In biology, there's trends in development. So if I put up pictures of people, you instantly can tell me, like, you don't even have the discussion, like, how old are they? Everybody knows roughly how old they are. The markers biologically are instantly identifiable. Pretty large eyes there, tiny little nose, must be a little kid. Weirdo mustache, must be, it's a dumb thing to have the discussion, everybody knows it. Essentially, the broadest question being asked in psychology is whether there's something similar, where if you saw people's patterns of thinking or emotion, you could figure out their age, roughly, in the same way that you can look at the person in the middle and figure out instantly that she's older than one of the other people and younger than one of the other ones, because there's something so systematic that it potentially is a complete human universal. For all humans, they look more like the one on the left in infancy. Maybe for all humans, there's a certain way of thinking or feeling, emotions, behavior that characterize a part of an area of, as they say, the life course during life. Finding and explaining that, in essence, is the gist of much of developmental psychology. What's interesting, I didn't think to say this when writing the chapter, what's interesting is that the answer to this question could be no. It's possible, if you imagine one of these analogies like a computer hard drive and then stuff gets loaded on it, it could get loaded on in any direction. There's no, guarantee that Word appears before Excel, and in principle, this stuff could get loaded on in any direction, and the environment would determine the sequence of development of the information system, to speak sort of technically. And environments vary dramatically. I'm just going to pull out 2 pictures from the textbook. Some people live in that environment, and some people live in that environment. So more of you in this room live on an environment on the left in which there's like 3 screens on at once, while you're playing guitar. Whereas the people on the right, if you haven't seen this in other courses, there are a number of societies to the present day that are genuine, as they say, hunter-gatherer societies. That there's no stores, there's no taxis going by. There is still in a world that resembles the physical environment of 10, 20,000 years ago. The individuals there are in a Hadza culture in northern Tanzania. There aren't very many of these, but there's actually a website. Why there's a website telling you where all these people are who really don't want everybody to invade with McDonald's sandwiches or something. But nonetheless, there are actually websites that show you the exact locations of the small number of still in existence, totally removed from industrialized world societies. It might be that one society versus another would produce entirely different patterns of development. The answer could be no, but psychologists are sort of banking on the fact that there are ways to identify systematic trends in development, and they look, in general, in 3 places. That is, there are 3 branches to this field if you do this for a living. And it's not uninteresting, as things go in the field of psychology. This is one of psychology's strongest genuine findings, it's surprising, they discovered something areas. There are 3 areas that we'll look at, and they encompass most of the field. The one we'll look at first gets called cognitive development. And again, the word cognitive tends to be used as an umbrella term to refer to knowing, thinking, patterns of thinking. The intuition here is that your style of thinking now certainly differs, if only an infant would crawl by, from that of the infant. So something happened. The infant is not thinking in some systematic, logical way that you at least sometimes are. Secondly, but it'll be thirdly in this class, I'm going to do it next time rather than today, is an area of moral development. If you haven't been in some other college class that brings this up, there's a domain of life that everybody recognizes as involving rights and wrongs. You just aren't allowed to do that. So if you imagine some little mental experiment, if somebody has a horrible tasting food, maybe you would, and if they say, I'll give you $10 to try it, you might try it. But if somebody says, I'll give you $10 to hit that old lady over the head with a brick, or you won't do it because you just can't do that. That's not in a cost-benefit analysis domain. That's in a completely right and wrong domain. Nothing would convince you it's okay to do it. You won't do it for fun, I hope. There's a form of thinking in the moral domain, and that also develops, potentially. It might be that if you're a judge in a court, your style of thinking in the moral domain is more sophisticated in some way than a 3-year-old child, and that's one topic. And finally, a huge topic of study is social development. Are there patterns of behavior and emotion that vary across life, or potentially that don't vary across life because they reflect, as we saw in the trait theories of personality, something inherited, and that inherited thing kind of sticks with you across life? That's such a big question in psychology that it'll come up 3 or 4 times in this class. The trait theories of personality, social development here, and later in the course, when the course becomes more biological, the analysis more systematically of exact genetic factors and how they shape particular aspects of brain and behavior in a chapter on nature and nurture and genetics that we'll get to later. Finally, one last preview. I know previews can get too long, and this one may have a minute ago. But one more, what's going on here is that the lifespan is long, especially now. Something that's kind of relevant to this field is that now the lifespan is 70 to 80 years old in a lot of industrialized countries. The lifespan was only like 50-something years old in the industrialized countries only a century and a half ago. Across the evolutionary environment of 50,000 years ago, my understanding is that the lifespan was under 30 years of age. So these people just weren't even there, the old people were in their 30s. So there's a lot of interesting questions about development. Some of this stuff can't be wired in by evolution because there were no people who were 72 years old, or rarely were any who were 72 years old 50,000 years ago. In any case, on the one hand, developmental psychology is interested in the whole lifespan, and you'll see things in the chapter and in class that go all the way up to the psychology of older adulthood. Yet, historically, the field has substantially focused on child development. So 75% of the activity is an analysis of the changes that occur often incredibly rapidly in the first dozen or so years of life. And you can imagine, it's actually almost easier if you're not in psychology and just do a casual analysis. You're different at age 19 than 17, but that's nothing compared to the difference between age like 0 and 2 or 2 and 4. There the changes are dramatic. At 2 months of age, people are just sort of sitting around gurgling, and then at 2 years, they can kind of start to communicate in language and do really sophisticated stuff. A lot of the action, of course, is happening in development early in life. So where we start is combining these two things, and this is where everybody starts in development because it also features one of these gigantic super figures of psychology who actually discovered something that you have to learn about in intro psychology within this, and we'll say who he is in a moment, within the study of cognitive development. So where we're starting, even though there are cognitive developments that occur from age 20 to 40, where we're starting is age like 0 to 10. What the heck is going on in the thinking processes of the child? So now the question is is there anything systematic going on? Is there anything to say besides the kid can do more stuff at age 10 than age 1 month? Obviously, something's happening, and the scientific question is there anything systematic, meaning essentially for all humans? That's the, often this fails, this all humans thing, but here it works pretty well. Is it the case that for essentially all humans, there's certain patterns that occur in the same way in that for all humans, there's certain biological patterns that occur? So finally, we'll get to the substance. It's easy to know where to start because this is one of those rare branches of the field where there's a person whose name will appear on the exam. That is one of these giganto figures of psychology. If you've singled out like 3 or 4 of them in the history of psychology with big impact, this is one of them, a guy named Jean Piaget, who I won't even ask. I suspect who's in psychology is one of the giant figures. He's not as well known as like an Einstein in physics, but it's almost that level of impact. In fact, probably no one has had more positive impact on psychology, even though somebody like Freud is more famous than Piaget. We won't do the biography of Piaget. You won't need to write down Switzerland as a multiple choice answer after it says Piaget. But the biography is interesting. I'll just do it for a sentence. This is one of these people who, for some crazy reason, was interested in science at age 7 and was publishing papers in scientific journals early in high school. It's weird, on like shellfish or something. And then later in life became interested in the philosophical and then psychological question, how do we get true knowledge about the world? Where does knowledge come from? And then essentially created an entire world of developmental cognitive psychology that just was not there before him. And even when he gets something wrong, people only learn he got it wrong because he inspired them to do a certain kind of study. If he had decided to study shellfish for whole his life instead of children, this entire field would look quite different. So what he did, as I in a sense already said, is to ask this kind of question: how do we pick up information, how do we gain knowledge about the world, the sort of knowledge that we take for granted? This thing is solid, there is time, a whole bunch of this stuff that's just a matter of, everyday knowing about the world. Before Piaget, there's 2 kinds of answers, and you saw them in chapter 1. One is that some of the stuff might be wired in. It's conceivable that in the same way that you don't have to teach people to breathe, there's air out there, start breathing, son, or else. It's wired in. It might be that there's a bunch of ideas. It's not impossible, and we'll see this concept more later in the course. Essentially, there's concepts that are wired in, some predisposition to just have a certain way of thinking. The other famous possibility before Piaget is that human learning is kind of like adding information to a hard drive. It's just an accumulation of facts. So the person is essentially, in a sense, a passive recording system, and you just drop facts in there, and after you drop 10,000 facts, the person has developed more than they were in their development when they had 1,000 facts. And there's sort of, some don't